My name is Zelina Peter. I have worked for everything I own, every piece of furniture in my home, every dollar in my savings account, every professional credential attached to my name. I earned with my own hands, my own mind, and years of refusing to quit when quitting would have been the far easier choice. I say that not to impress you. I say it so you understand exactly what it meant when I opened my banking app on a Thursday evening in February and watched my life tilt sideways without warning. Hello, my wonderful and loyal family. Welcome back to your very own channel, Mr. Peter Stories. Before we start, I have one little favor to ask. If you ever find my stories on another channel, please report them and let me know. Your love and support help keep this family strong. Be sure to watch until the very end and promise me you'll tell me in the comments what lesson you learned from today's story. If you don't, I'll be very, very disappointed with you. Now sit back, relax, and let's continue the story. It was a regular Thursday, the kind that grinds you down without any single dramatic moment, just a long accumulation of meetings, deadlines, and fluorescent lighting. I work as a senior financial analyst at a firm on West Peachtree Street in Midtown Atlanta. I track numbers for a living. I see patterns before other people see problems. That skill has served me well professionally for years. It had never once protected me at home. I stopped at the Publix on Peachtree Road Northwest on my way back to Collier Hills. Nothing remarkable about it. I needed olive oil, a rotisserie chicken, and something cold to drink. I had my canvas bag on my shoulder and my coat buttoned against the February chill, and I was thinking about nothing more significant than whether I wanted sparkling water or still. I was standing in the checkout line when I opened my banking app out of habit. Just a routine glance. The kind of check I perform without thinking, the way a pilot scans instruments, even when the sky is perfectly clear. I scrolled down, and I stopped breathing. 3 transactions sat at the top of my recent activity like something placed there by a stranger. A Delta Airlines round trip from Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport to Nassau, Bahamas. A deposit charged to Atlantis Paradise Island Resort. A purchase from a luxury luggage boutique in Buckhead. The total across all 3 charges was $4,920. My card had been in my coat pocket all week. I stepped out of the checkout line without apologizing to the woman behind me. I walked to the far end of the store, near the floral section, and stood there under those soft lights, surrounded by roses and white lilies, and I examined every detail of those 3 transactions until my vision went slightly unfocused at the edges. The name on the airline booking was La Quinta Fen. I want you to understand what that name meant when I saw it attached to my money. La Quinta Fen is the younger sister of my husband Richard Edward. She is 26 years old. She has never held a job longer than 4 months. She lives in her mother's house in Stone Mountain, Georgia, and she has spent her entire adult life being handed things she did not earn by a woman who taught her that wanting something was the same as deserving it. That woman is Dorothea Fenn, Richard's mother, my mother-in-law of 7 years. I called Richard. The phone rang once, twice, 4 times, 7 times. I stood there in that Publix floral section with the smell of fresh flowers surrounding me and the sound of unanswered ringing filling my ear, and something cold and precise settled in my chest. Not panic, not rage, something quieter and far more dangerous than either of those things. The call went to voicemail. I hung up without leaving a message. I walked to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and did not start the engine. I pulled up the Delta booking confirmation using the transaction reference number and verified what I already knew. The ticket was purchased using my card number. The passenger name was La Quinta Fen. The departure was the following morning, Friday, out of Hartsfield-Jackson. The return was 4 days later. Someone had planned this carefully. Someone had held my card number, recorded it deliberately, and waited for what they considered the right moment to use it. My card had never left my possession. But 6 weeks earlier, Dorothea had come to our house in Collier Hills for a Sunday family dinner. I had cooked. Richard had grilled. We had sat around our own table and fed his family, and afterward, I had left a receipt on the kitchen counter, a receipt from an online purchase that had arrived that afternoon. A small domestic detail, the kind that disappears into an ordinary Sunday without consequence. I did not know then that someone at my table had looked at that receipt and made a calculation. I sat in that parking lot for a long time. Atlanta moved around me, cars pulling in and out, shopping carts rolling across asphalt, the ordinary commerce of a Thursday evening continuing without interruption. None of it had anything to do with the $4,920 missing from my account. I thought about calling my best friend Sibella Marsh. Sibella has known me since our years at Georgia State. She is the kind of woman who answers on the first ring and asks questions second. I decided to wait. Not because I needed more time to think, I already knew what I was going to do. I waited because I wanted to be completely certain before I moved a single step. In my profession, you do not act on the first reading of a number. You verify, you document, you build your case before you bring it to anyone. I went back into that Publix and bought my olive oil and my rotisserie chicken and my sparkling water. I paid with a different card. I drove home to Collier Hills with both hands on the wheel and the radio off, and my mind moving through everything with methodical precision. Richard's car was in the driveway when I arrived. The kitchen light was on. I could see his silhouette through the window before I reached the front door. He was on his phone. He ended the call quickly when he heard my key in the lock, more quickly than a man with nothing to hide ever ends a call. He turned around and looked at me with an expression I had seen before but never accurately named until that moment. It was the expression of a man who had received advance warning, a man who had spent several hours constructing something that resembled composure. "Hey," he said. I put my grocery bag on the counter. I took off my coat. I hung it on the hook by the door exactly as I did every evening. I poured myself a glass of water and drank half of it, standing at the kitchen sink, looking out at our backyard in the dark. Then I turned around and looked at my husband. "I need you to tell me," I said, "what you know about the charges on my account." The kitchen went very quiet. Richard opened his mouth, and before a single word came out, I watched something move across his face, a decision being made in real time about how much truth the moment required. "She said she will pay it back," he said. 4 words. That was his opening. Not denial, not outrage on my behalf, not the response of a man who had just learned his wife's account had been fraudulently accessed. He went straight to mitigation, straight to management, straight to the language of a man who already knew. I set my glass down on the counter. "When?" I said. "Did she tell you that?" He did not answer immediately. The pause before his response was not long. 3 seconds, perhaps. But I have spent my entire career understanding that what lives inside a pause is always more truthful than what comes after it. I had my answer before he opened his mouth. I picked up my glass, finished my water, rinsed it in the sink, and placed it in the dish rack with a steadiness that surprised even me. Then I walked to the guest room, closed the door behind me, sat on the edge of the bed in the dark, and opened my banking app. I froze the card. I began the fraud report process, methodically, precisely, and completely alone. This was not the beginning of what Dorothea Fenn had taken from me, but it was absolutely the end of what she ever would. Chapter 2. What Dorothea built before I arrived. I did not sleep that night. I lay on the guest room bed with my eyes open, and 7 years of marriage moving through my mind. Like a film I had watched so many times, I had stopped noticing what was actually in it. That is the cruelty of a slow erosion. You do not feel it happening in any single moment. You only recognize it when you stand back far enough to see the shape of what has been worn away. My name is Zalina Peter, not Zalina Edward. I kept my name when I married Richard, and Dorothea Fenn never forgave me for it. She did not say so directly. Dorothea was never direct. She operated through implication, through careful omission, through the precise calibration of warmth she offered and withheld, depending on how useful you were to her in any given moment. I met Richard Edward at a rooftop gathering in Inman Park in the spring of our 34th year. It was the kind of Atlanta evening that makes you forget the city has any edges, soft and warm, with the skyline sitting just right against a darkening sky, and laughter coming from every corner of that rooftop without effort. Richard was standing near the railing and he laughed at something, and I thought without meaning to that he had an honest laugh, the kind that does not perform itself. We talked for 2 hours that night. He called me 3 days later. By the 3rd month, I knew I was in love with him. What I did not fully understand then was that Richard came with an architecture already in place, a hierarchy, a system of loyalties built long before I arrived, and I was expected to fit inside that system, not beside it. I was renting a room in Decatur at the time, carrying my student loans and my ambition in equal measure, building myself from the ground up with the disciplined optimism that keeps a woman moving when her circumstances have not yet caught up to what she knows she is capable of becoming. I had nothing that Dorothea Fenn considered impressive. The first Sunday dinner in Stone Mountain arrived in October of that first year. A brick ranch-style house with a well-kept yard and a front door painted deep burgundy. Richard squeezed my hand in the driveway. I told him I was fine. I believed then that warmth was transferable, that if I brought enough into a room, enough would come back. Dorothea opened the door and looked at me 1 second longer than a greeting requires. "So you're Zelina," she said. "Not welcome. Not it is wonderful to finally meet you. Just, so you're Zelina," as if confirming something she had suspected, and not pleasantly. I extended my hand and smiled. She accepted the compliment about her home and led us inside without accepting the hand. I noted it. I said nothing. The first Christmas arrived 2 months later. Richard's cousins were there. LaQuinta was there, 19 years old and already deeply comfortable in her sense of entitlement. After dinner, Dorothea moved through the living room distributing gifts she had wrapped herself, specific, chosen, personal gifts for every person in that room. Richard received a leather wallet. LaQuinta received a new phone. The cousins received gift cards to stores they actually used. Dorothea turned to me last. She held out a small envelope and watched my face as I opened it. Inside was a grocery store gift card with the store name scratched off the front with a coin. Not faded, deliberately scratched. The silver surface beneath the logo had been worked at until it was completely unreadable. I looked at it for 1 full second. Then I looked up at Dorothea, and I smiled, and I said, "Thank you so much. This is so thoughtful." She nodded as if she agreed entirely. Richard was looking at his new wallet. He did not see my face. He did not see his mother's face. He did not see any of it. I folded the envelope closed and tucked it into my purse and picked up my glass of sweet tea and rejoined the conversation around me with a smile I held in place for the next 2 hours without allowing it to slip once. That was my first mistake, and it was the mistake from which every subsequent one grew. What I communicated in that living room in Stone Mountain on that December evening was something I had not intended to communicate and would spend 7 years paying for. I told Dorothea Fenn without words that I could be handed the least and would respond with gratitude, that I would smooth over the sharp edges of her contempt and call it graciousness, that the peace of the room mattered more to me than the truth of what was happening inside it. She heard me clearly. She never forgot what I said. The years built themselves on that foundation. There were genuine good moments. Richard and I built a life in Collier Hills that held real joy. We traveled. We laughed easily. We held each other through difficult seasons and celebrated victories with genuine warmth. The marriage was not a fiction, but it had a fault line running through its center. Dorothea borrowed money from us twice across those 7 years and repaid it once. The second time she never mentioned it again, and Richard never pursued it. I watched the amount leave our joint account and said nothing, because Richard had asked me quietly, with the exhausted love of a man managing a difficult parent since childhood, to let it go. I let it go. LaQuinta borrowed my car one afternoon and returned it the following morning with the tank empty and a fresh scratch along the rear passenger door. She said the scratch was probably already there. Richard suggested we have it touched up. I paid for it myself and did not raise the subject again. I funded an entire Thanksgiving, groceries, turkey, desserts, folding chairs for the extra guests, entirely from my personal account because Richard mentioned his mother was having a difficult month financially. Dorothea sat at the head of the table I had set in her own home and accepted the meal I had prepared as if it had simply materialized there. LaQuinta asked for seconds without looking at me when I passed her the dish. These are not dramatic stories. That is precisely the point. The theft Dorothea committed against me over 7 years was not singular or sudden. It was gradual, cumulative, and dressed always in the ordinary clothing of difficult family dynamics. It looked like personality rather than predation. It looked like generational difference rather than calculated disrespect, but it was theft. Of my money eventually. But long before the charges appeared on my banking app, it was a theft of something I could not enter into any spreadsheet. My time, my labor, my silence. The version of myself I kept making incrementally smaller, so there was room enough at every gathering for Dorothea's comfort, LaQuinta's ease, and Richard's carefully maintained peace. I lay in that guest room, and I thought about the woman who had smiled at a scratched-off gift card in a Stone Mountain living room and said, "Thank you." I thought about everything I had been willing to accept in the name of keeping surfaces smooth, and I understood with the particular clarity that only a sleepless night can produce that the $4,920 on my banking app was not the wound. It was simply the moment the wound finally became visible. Chapter 3. Richard's 3-second pause. I have always believed that the truth lives not in what a person says, but in the breath before they say it. I learned that professionally. I learned to read the pause before a client answers a direct question about their finances. I learned to hear the hesitation that lives between what someone knows and what they have decided to share. I spent years sharpening that skill inside conference rooms and boardrooms on West Peachtree Street. I had never once applied it to my own husband. I applied it that Thursday night. I had asked Richard a simple question. He had responded immediately, too immediately, with mitigation. She said she will pay it back. 4 words that told me everything about who he had spoken to and when, long before I walked through our front door. But I needed the answer to a different question, the one underneath. I stood in our kitchen in Collier Hills with the overhead light too bright, and I looked at my husband and I asked him directly, did he know before it happened? 3 seconds. I counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. A genuinely innocent man does not pause 3 seconds before answering that question. He responds immediately, with confusion, with offense, with protective anger on behalf of his wife. A man with no prior knowledge does not take 3 seconds to arrange his face the way Richard arranged his before he opened his mouth. I did not know she was going to use your card, he said. I noticed the careful architecture of that sentence immediately. He did not say he did not know. He said he did not know she was going to use my card. The distinction was surgical, and he did not even realize he had made it. But you knew about the trip, I said. He looked at the counter. She mentioned she wanted to take LaQuinta somewhere. She said she was working on the finances. And you said nothing to me. I did not think she would. You did not think, I said. Or you did not want to have the conversation?" He was quiet. "I want to be fair to Richard Edward because fairness is a discipline I refuse to abandon, even when I am the one being wronged. He is not a dishonest man in the way that word is commonly understood. He does not lie with intent. He omits with it. The difference in motivation does not change the damage." Richard had spent his entire life in Dorothea's orbit, learning that the smoothest path through any situation was the path of least confrontation. He managed his mother the way some men manage a difficult workplace, through strategic silence, careful positioning, and the quiet sacrifice of whoever was least likely to retaliate. For 7 years that person had been me, not because he did not love me. I believe he loved me genuinely. But love without the courage to protect its object is incomplete. It is warmth without shelter, an open hand that cannot close around what it is supposed to hold. I pulled out a chair from the kitchen table and sat down, not because I was tired, because I wanted the conversation to shift, to become deliberate rather than something we were both standing inside without footing. "Sit down, Richard," I said. He sat. "I need you to tell me everything," I said. "Not what you think I want to hear. Not what manages this situation most comfortably for everyone. Everything." What came out over the next 30 minutes was not a confession of guilt. It was something more complicated and more painful than that. Richard told me Dorothea had called him approximately 10 days before the charges appeared on my account. She had said La Quinta was going through a difficult period, and she wanted to do something meaningful for her. She had mentioned Nassau. She had mentioned she was working on the finances. Richard had listened. He had not offered our money. He had not suggested my account. But he had also not said the words that mattered most. "Do not go near what belongs to my wife." He had said nothing. He had set it aside and told himself it was not his problem to manage until it became one. It became one while I was standing in a Publix checkout line on Peachtree Road Northwest. "She has done this before," I said. "Not the card specifically, but this. Taking something and assuming it will be absorbed." "Zelina." "I am not asking for an argument," I said. "I am telling you what I have observed for 7 years." He looked at the table. "I know you have observed it too," I said. "The kitchen was very quiet. I told him I had already frozen the card. I told him I had already initiated the fraud report. I told him that in the morning I intended to file a formal criminal complaint." His head came up sharply. "Zelina, she is my family." "She is," I said, "and I am your wife." I let that sit between us. Then I stood up, pushed my chair in, and walked to the guest room. I closed the door quietly and sat on the edge of the bed in the dark. I thought about 3 seconds. 3 seconds is not a long time by any ordinary measure, but it is long enough to understand everything you need to. I picked up my phone. I sent Sibella one text. "I need you in the morning." Then I lay back and stared at the ceiling, and I did not cry. The feeling in my chest was not grief, and it was not anger. It was clarity. The particular luminous clarity that arrives when something you have been almost knowing for a long time finally steps completely into the light. Chapter 4, 42 Calls. Sibella Marsh arrived at my front door at 7:45 on Friday morning with 2 coffees from a place on North Highland Avenue that she knows I love, and an expression that communicated, before I said a single word, that she had already decided whose side she was on. That is the kind of woman Sibella is. She commits first and assesses from a position of complete loyalty. She has been the right person for me since our first year at Georgia State, when she sat beside me in an economics lecture and whispered a commentary on the professor's methodology that was both surgically accurate and entirely hilarious. I opened the door and she looked at me and said, "Tell me everything." We sat at my kitchen table and I laid it out the way I would present a financial discrepancy to a client, chronologically precisely, without the distortion that emotion produces when allowed to run ahead of facts. The Thursday evening, the Publix on Peachtree Road Northwest, the banking app, the 3 charges, LaQuinta Fenn's name attached to a Delta Airlines booking paid for with my card, Richard arriving home already knowing, his 3-second pause, the guest room. Cybella listened without interrupting once. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Where is Richard now?" "He left for work an hour ago," I said. "He knocked on the guest room door this morning. I told him I needed space." "And LaQuinta?" "In Nassau," I said. "On my money." Cybella set her cup down with quiet finality. "All right," she said. "We start this morning." We drove together to the Atlanta Police Department precinct on Ponce de Leon Avenue. I had the bank documentation printed and organized, the transaction records, the booking confirmation with LaQuinta's name clearly attached, the card freeze confirmation, the fraud report submission. The detective at the front desk took my documentation and listened to my account without visible surprise. Financial fraud within families, she told me without elaborating, was not uncommon. The formal criminal complaint was filed before 10 in the morning. We left the precinct and drove to Ponce City Market. We found a corner table in a cafe on the main floor and ordered coffee and settled in. Atlanta moved around us in its ordinary Friday morning rhythm, indifferent to what 2 women were carrying at a corner table. I looked at my phone. The calls had started. Dorothea Fenn had called me for the first time at 11:18 Thursday night, approximately 4 hours after I froze the card and submitted the initial fraud report. The freeze had flagged and declined pending charges connected to LaQuinta's Nassau bookings. Dorothea had understood quickly that something had fundamentally changed. By Friday morning, the call count had already reached 19. Cybella looked at the screen. "May I?" she said. I handed her the phone. She placed it on the table between us, opened the voicemail log, and pressed play on the first message. We listened to every single one in sequence. Cybella had a small recording device from her years in corporate litigation support, and she recorded each voicemail as it played without comment. I will tell you what those messages sounded like, because in their progression from first to last, they contained a portrait of Dorothea Fenn, more honest than anything she had ever voluntarily revealed about herself in 7 years. The first several calls were measured and controlled. Her voice was careful and somewhat gentle. A performance. She said there had been a misunderstanding. She said she hoped we could resolve things as a family before they became something larger than necessary. She used the word family the way certain people always use it, as a solvent intended to dissolve accountability before it can fully form. By the middle calls, her composure had thinned considerably. She said she could not understand why I was doing this. She said she had always tried her best with me. She said I was choosing a bank over my own family, as if $4,920 were a bureaucratic inconvenience I was prioritizing out of spite rather than money taken from me without knowledge or consent. By the calls in the high 20s, her voice had changed entirely. She told me I was selfish. She told me I had never truly embraced Richard's family. She told me a woman who files a police report against her husband's family is not a woman who genuinely loves her husband. I listened to that particular voicemail twice. By the calls in the 30s, she was crying. Not quiet, contained crying. The loud, unguarded crying of a woman who has realized that the mechanism she always relied upon, the guilt, the family loyalty, the appeal to harmony, were not going to function this time. She said she was sorry. She said LaQuinta was her child, and she had only wanted to give her something beautiful, and she had not thought clearly. The 40-second call arrived at 2:17 on Friday afternoon. By that point, Cybella and I had been sitting in that cafe for hours. We had eaten lunch. We had moved through a third round of coffee. The 40-second call lasted 40 seconds. Dorothea's voice was flat, stripped, the voice of a woman who has exhausted every register she possesses and arrived at something underneath all of them she had never intended anyone to hear. She said, "Zelina, I know you are listening to these. I know you hear me. I need you to understand that what I did was wrong. I know it was wrong, but you are about to destroy this family, and I am begging you, please call me back." The message ended. Sibella stopped the recording. She set the phone between us. We were both quiet. Then Sibella looked at me and said, "She called you 42 times, and not once did she ask if you were all right." I looked at the phone on the table. She was right. Across 42 calls, and all those accumulated minutes, Dorothea had expressed fear and regret and desperation and anger and grief. She had appealed to family loyalty and to my love for Richard and to her own intentions. She had not once asked how I was. She had not once acknowledged that what she had done had happened to a specific person, to me, and that that person might be sitting somewhere carrying something that had nothing to do with Dorothea's comfort or fear. I picked up my coffee cup. It had gone cold. 42 calls, I said. 42, Sibella confirmed quietly. I thought about the scratched-off gift card, the Sunday dinners, the borrowed car returned damaged and empty, the Thanksgiving funded entirely from my account, 7 years of patience dressed in the clothing of grace. I thought about La Quinta in Nassau at that moment, at a resort purchased on my card, carrying luggage purchased on my card, having arrived on a flight purchased on my card, living inside a vacation constructed entirely from something taken from me without hesitation. I set the cup down. "Keep that recording somewhere completely safe," I said. Sibella patted the device in her jacket pocket. "Already backed up in 2 places," she said. I nodded. I had spent my entire professional life understanding that the record, properly kept, carefully documented, accurately preserved, tells the truth even when every person in the room is motivated to obscure it. Dorothea Fenn had called me 42 times. She had left 42 pieces of evidence. Sibella had recorded every single one. The record existed. Now it was simply a matter of what I chose to build with it. Chapter 5. La Quinta comes home with nothing. There is a particular kind of humiliation that money cannot cushion and status cannot soften. La Quinta Fenn discovered that on a Saturday afternoon at Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, with 2 bags purchased on my card and a fury she had absolutely no right to carry. I know the precise sequence of events because the resort in Nassau contacted me directly, not Dorothea, not Richard. Me, because the card the reservation was attached to was mine, and the fraud claim I had filed had flagged every pending charge connected to that booking. A customer service representative called my cell on Friday afternoon, while Sibella and I were still at our corner table in Ponce City Market, and explained with professional courtesy that all remaining charges on the reservation had been declined, and the guest had been formally informed. I thanked her. I told her she had done exactly the right thing. I did not feel satisfaction when I ended that call. Satisfaction would have been too small and too clean a feeling for that moment. What I felt was something steadier, something that had been building quietly for 7 years and had finally found its proper and permanent shape. I drove home to Collier Hills alone that evening. Sibella offered to come. I told her I did not need her for this particular part. There are moments a woman needs her closest friend beside her, and there are moments she needs to stand inside her own house on her own 2 feet, without anyone to lean against. This was the second kind entirely. Richard was home when I arrived. He had called me 4 times throughout the day, and I had answered once, briefly and calmly, to tell him I was well and that we would speak when I returned. He was in the living room when I walked through the door, looking like a man who had spent the entire day sitting inside his own guilt, without anywhere to set it down. I told him La Quinta's remaining charges had been declined. He closed his eyes. I went to bed. La Quinta arrived on our doorstep the following afternoon. I heard the knock from the kitchen where I was making tea. A hard knock. The knock of someone who has been genuinely inconvenienced and has arrived already convinced the inconvenience belongs to someone else. I set my cup down, walked to the front door, and opened it. LaQuinta Fenn stood on my porch with her luggage at her feet, and an expression I can only describe as the expression of a person who has spent the flight home confusing being caught with being wronged. She had come directly from the airport. Her eyes were swollen from crying out of frustration rather than genuine remorse. There is a clear difference between those two kinds of tears, and I know it well enough by now to read it without effort. She had prepared for a confrontation, for raised voices, for the kind of heated exchange that gets resolved through tears and promises and the restoration of a comfortable surface that everyone pretends is solid ground. She had not prepared for what was actually waiting at the door. "I need to talk to you," she said. "Do you have legal representation?" I said. She blinked. The question landed on her like cold water. "What?" "An attorney," I said. "Do you currently have one?" The word attorney did something to her posture that no raised voice could have accomplished. All the rehearsed justifications she had constructed somewhere over the Atlantic, none of them had been built for this question delivered in this tone. "Zelina," she said, "I just need to explain. If you do not have representation," I said, "I would strongly suggest securing some before we have any further conversation." Behind me, I heard Richard come in from the hallway. He appeared at my shoulder the way he always appeared in these moments, positioned between his wife and his family, trying through proximity alone to prevent two things from fully colliding. "LaQuinta," he said. His voice carried the exhausted appeal of a man who can feel something moving beyond his ability to manage. "Richard," I said, quietly, without turning to look at him. "Sit down." A pause. Then I heard him step back, the sound of him lowering himself onto the living room sofa, behind me. "Out of this. I want you to understand what that moment meant, not as a triumph over my husband, but as a line drawn clearly in a place where no line had ever been permitted to stand. For 7 years, every room that included Dorothea or LaQuinta had been arranged the same way, their needs at the center, Richard managing the edges, and me somewhere in the background, ensuring everything ran smoothly for everyone else. That arrangement had produced a woman who felt entirely comfortable photographing my card receipt and booking a vacation on my account without pausing once to consider what she was doing. I was done arranging rooms for other people's comfort. LaQuinta stood on my porch, and the fury she had arrived with collapsed from the inside. I watched it happen. The justifications came first. She had needed this trip. She had been going through something difficult. She had intended to tell me. She had planned to replace every dollar before I noticed. Each sentence dissolved before it finished, because she could hear, as she produced each one exactly how it sounded. Then came real tears, not the performed desperation of her mother's voicemails, but the genuine tears of a young woman confronting at serious personal cost what the system she had been raised inside had built in her. I did not soften. I want to be clear about that. Her tears were real, and I recognized them as real, and I felt something human stir in me. But compassion and consequence are not opposites. A woman can hold both simultaneously. I had learned that at considerable personal expense. "I understand that you are distressed," I said. "But LaQuinta, you used my financial information without my knowledge or consent to purchase airline tickets, a resort reservation, and luggage. That is not a family disagreement. That is a crime. The police report has been filed. The bank investigation is underway. None of that changes based on this conversation." She looked past me at Richard with the look she had used her entire life. "Say something. Fix this. Make it stop." The look of a woman who had always found accommodation waiting there. Richard said nothing. I watched the precise moment she understood that had changed. She picked up her bags. She walked back down the front path to the car she had left running at the curb, the small, thoughtless habit of a person who has never genuinely had to think about the cost of anything, and she drove away without looking back. I stood in my open doorway. The Collier Hill street was quiet in the way Atlanta's residential streets go quiet on a Sunday afternoon, unhurried and leafy with the sounds of the city present, but pleasantly distant. I closed the front door. I walked back to the kitchen. I picked up my cup of tea, which had gone lukewarm, and I finished it, standing at the counter looking out at the backyard. Richard came to the kitchen doorway. "You told me to sit down," he said, not with anger, with something closer to recognition. "Yes," I said, "in front of my sister." "Yes." He was quiet. "I sat down," he said. "I know," I said. I rinsed my cup and placed it in the dish rack. Then I turned and looked at my husband standing in the kitchen doorway, and I saw a man at the beginning of something, not the end, the beginning, though I could not tell you then what exactly it was the beginning of. "We need to talk," Richard said. "A real conversation." "We do," I agreed. I walked past him into the hallway, not with coldness, with the composure of a woman who has decided that her timing belongs entirely to her now. Tonight, I needed stillness. Tomorrow would carry whatever it needed to carry. Chapter 6. What the investigation uncovered. The bank's fraud investigation team contacted me formally on a Tuesday morning, 10 days after I filed the initial report. I sat at my desk on West Peachtree Street with my office door closed and my notepad open, and I listened to every detail the investigator laid out without interrupting once. Dorothea Fenn had accessed my card number from a receipt, not guessed it, not obtained it through any technical means. She had looked at a paper receipt sitting on my kitchen counter during a Sunday family dinner and photographed it with her phone. The bank's investigation had obtained the relevant phone records as part of the fraud documentation. The photograph existed in Dorothea's camera roll with a timestamp, placing it precisely during the evening of that dinner. An evening I remembered clearly, because I had cooked a full meal and set the table carefully, and Dorothea had eaten everything I prepared without once acknowledging a single thing I had made. The receipt had been on the counter because an online order arrived that afternoon, and I had set it there, meaning to file it after dinner. A routine domestic moment, the kind that occurs in every household without consequence. Except that someone at my table had seen it and made a considered decision. The investigator walked me through the timeline with complete precision. The photograph was taken during the dinner. The card number was held for approximately 6 weeks before being used. Consistent with deliberate planning rather than any form of impulsive action, the airline booking was made first. The resort deposit followed within 40 minutes. The luggage purchase came the following morning. I wrote it all down, and I sat with one word for a very long time: deliberate. Dorothea had not acted in a desperate moment or a lapse of judgment. She had sat at my table, photographed my receipt, held the information for 6 weeks, and executed a plan. That realization stripped away the last quiet pocket of charitable interpretation I had been carrying underneath everything. The idea that perhaps she had acted impulsively, driven by some desperate maternal need. The investigation removed that completely and permanently. She had planned it. I set my pen down. I looked at the window. I let the full weight of that word settle before I moved on. What happened 2 days later I had not anticipated. I was sitting at my desk when my cell phone rang, a number I did not recognize with an Atlanta area code. I answered. The woman on the line spoke quietly and quickly, as if she had rehearsed the opening sentence several times and was now simply executing it before she lost her nerve. She told me she was a member of Richard's extended family, a cousin by marriage, and that she needed to share something with me that she believed I had a right to know. I did not ask questions. I simply said, "Tell me." What she said next changed the entire architecture of what I thought I was living inside. Before I came into Richard's life, he had been in a serious relationship with a woman named Renata Stubbs. They were together nearly 3 years. Dorothea had never accepted Renata, too independent, too self-directed, insufficiently deferential to the loyalty Dorothea required. In the final year of that relationship, Dorothea had accessed Renata's financial information through a check Renata had written to Richard for a shared expense. A check Richard had left on his childhood bedroom dresser during a family visit. Dorothea had used the account number to make 2 withdrawals, small enough to be attributed to banking error, large enough to cause Renata genuine difficulty. Renata had not filed a police report. She had gone to Richard. Richard had asked her, with the exhausted love of a man managing a difficult parent since childhood, to let him handle it quietly as a family matter. Renata had agreed. The handling produced nothing. Dorothea repaid nothing. The relationship between Richard and Renata ended within 4 months. I sat at my desk with the phone against my ear, and I listened to every word, and I felt something move through me that was not surprise. That was the part that told me everything, not the story itself, but the complete absence of surprise with which I received it. "Does Richard know you are telling me this?" I asked. "No," she said. "Did he know the full extent of what happened to Renata?" A pause. "Yes," she said. "He knew." I thanked her. I ended the call. I sat in my closed office on West Peachtree Street, and I looked at the window for a long time. Richard had known exactly what his mother was capable of doing to a woman he loved. He had watched it happen to Renata Stubbs. He had seen every step of it, the access, the theft, the quiet family management, the end of the relationship, and then he had met me and brought me into his mother's orbit and watched 7 years pass and said nothing. He had not warned me. He had chosen his peace over my protection, continuously, for 7 years. That evening I walked into our kitchen. Richard was home. He looked at my face when I walked in, and he knew immediately something had moved to a different and more serious place. "Sit down," I said. He sat. I told him everything. The bank investigator's confirmation, the receipt photograph and its timestamp, the 6-week deliberate waiting period. And then I told him what I had learned about Renata Stubbs, the check, the withdrawals, the quiet family management, the 4 months, the end. He did not deny a single word. He sat at our kitchen table with both hands flat on the surface, and he looked at me and said nothing to contradict anything I had said, and that particular absence of denial was the moment I understood the full geography of what I had been living inside. "You knew what she was," I said. "Zelina, you knew before we married. You had seen it. And you brought me into 7 years of something you could have warned me about." He looked at his hands. "I told myself she had changed," he said. "I told myself it was different. I told myself it would not happen again. Or you told yourself that if it did, I would handle it the way Renata did," I said. "Quietly, as a family matter." He said nothing. The kitchen was very quiet. "I am not Renata Stubbs," I said. I stood up. I left him sitting at the table. I walked to the guest room, and I sat on the edge of the bed, and I looked at my hands in my lap. I thought about what a woman does when the ground beneath her turns out to have been hollow all along. She does not fall. She finds where the solid ground actually is. And she begins, with great care and complete intention, to move toward it. Chapter 7. Savannah. I left on a Thursday morning before Richard woke up. I did not leave a dramatic note. I did not stage my departure for effect. I packed a single bag, the small leather duffel I had bought myself years ago for work travel. The one Dorothea had once commented was too plain for a woman who claimed to have refined taste. And I carried it quietly to my car in the grey pre-dawn stillness of Collier Hills and drove south on Interstate 16 toward Savannah with my phone on silent and both hands steady on the wheel. I had not booked anywhere in advance. That was deliberate. My whole life had been structured around planning, the careful management of variables and outcomes and potential disruptions. I had planned meals, managed moods, anticipated needs, and smoothed surfaces for 7 years inside a marriage, and longer than that inside a career that rewarded precision above nearly everything else. I needed for a few days to arrive somewhere without having arranged it first. I found a small inn on Jones Street in the Savannah Historic District, a narrow townhouse with white columns and a blue-painted door and window boxes that still held the dried remnants of autumn flowers. The woman at the front desk was warm and unhurried in the way Savannah moves in general, as if the city itself decided long ago that urgency was merely a visitor passing through and not a permanent resident. She gave me a room on the second floor with tall windows, looking out over the quiet street, and a white coverlet on the bed, and a small wooden desk near the window, where the morning light arrived at a low and generous angle. I put my bag down. I sat on the edge of the bed. I looked at the room around me. For the first time in nearly 2 weeks, I did not have to be anyone in particular. I walked the squares that first morning. Savannah is built around its squares, set into the city's grid like green rooms in an open house, each one holding its own distinct character, each one carrying a particular quality of stillness that the rest of the city moves around without disturbing. I walked through Chippewa Square and Lafayette Square and came eventually to Forsyth Park, where the great fountain sits at the center of the long promenade and the live oaks line every path, with their Spanish moss hanging in long, undisturbed curtains from every branch. I sat on a bench near the fountain for a long time. I was not thinking about Dorothea. I was not rehearsing conversations or constructing arguments or calculating next steps. I was simply sitting in Forsyth Park on a Thursday morning, watching the fountain and the people and the dogs on leashes and the joggers and an elderly couple on a bench across the path sharing something quietly from a paper bag, and I was allowing the city to be exactly what it was, without requiring it to mean anything. That was new. The not requiring. I walked back to the inn in the late afternoon and sat at the small desk by the window and opened my notebook. Not the work notebook with its clean columns, but a personal one, soft-covered, that I had kept inconsistently for years, and I wrote at the top of a blank page a single question. How much of yourself did you set down so that everyone else had enough room? I did not answer it immediately. I let it sit on the page, and I looked at it the way I look at a figure telling me something I have not yet fully processed. Then I wrote for a long time. I wrote about the woman I had been when I first arrived in Atlanta, with my degree and my student loans, and my 5-year plan revised every January with disciplined optimism. That woman had been ferocious in a quiet way, certain of herself, unencumbered by anyone else's vision of how much space she was permitted to occupy. I wrote about the scratched-off gift card and the smile I had held in place for 2 hours in that Stone Mountain living room, and the version of myself I had been quietly diminishing ever since. I wrote about the 7 years, not every accumulated detail, but the overall arc, a woman who had arrived in a marriage with a clear and confident sense of herself, and had spent years, in increments so gradual she barely felt them, making herself progressively less. I sat at that desk in Savannah, and I wrote until the light through the tall windows changed from afternoon to early evening, and my hand ached, and the page in front of me was completely full. Then I picked up my phone for the first time that entire day. I called my mother. My mother lives in a small house in Macon, Georgia, where she has lived for most of her adult life. She is 67 years old, and she raised me largely on her own, and she did it with a combination of fierce practicality and deep, unwavering love that I have spent most of my adult life trying to fully understand. She answered on the second ring. "Zalina," she said, "just my name." But in her voice my name has always carried more information than most people manage with full sentences. "Hey, Mama," I said. "Where are you?" "Savannah," I said. "I needed some time." A brief pause. "Tell me," she said. I told her everything. The card, the charges, LaQuinta's name on the booking, Richard's 3-second pause, the 42 calls, the fraud investigation findings, the deliberate 6-week planning period, the call from Richard's family member, and what she had told me about Renata Stubbs, Richard's admission that he had known all of it before we ever married. My mother listened the way she has always listened, completely, without interruption, without the impatient interjections of a person waiting for a gap to insert their own response. When I finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough for me to look out my Savannah window at the evening street below and watch a young woman walk past alone with her coat pulled close and her face slightly upward as if she was looking at something above the old rooftops. Then my mother said something I had not been prepared to hear. She said, "I watched you shrink, Zelina, these years. I watched you make yourself smaller in that house and smaller at those dinners, and I said nothing. I told myself it was your life and your marriage and it was not my place to interfere. But I watched it happen from the outside and I stayed quiet, and that silence is my failing too." I did not speak. "I should have said something years before now," she continued, "not to tell you what to do, simply to tell you what I could see from where I was standing. Because sometimes a woman gets so deep inside the adjusting, so practiced at it, so accustomed to the weight of it, that she genuinely needs someone on the outside to describe the shape of what she is carrying." Something gave way inside my chest. Not the frightening give of something structural failing, but the particular release of a thing held too tightly for too long, finally being allowed to ease. I pressed one hand flat against the surface of the desk. The wood was solid and cool under my palm. "Why did you stay quiet, Mama?" I asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Because you seemed content," she said, "or close enough to content that I convinced myself I was seeing what I wanted to see, and because I have made my own peace, too early, too quietly, with things I should have walked away from sooner. And I did not trust my own judgment enough to know the difference between patience and surrender." We talked for a long time after that, about her and about me, about the particular inheritance that moves between mothers and daughters without anyone intending to pass it, the learned habit of absorption, the confusion of endurance with strength, the way a woman can mistake the absence of complaint for the presence of contentment and spend years living inside that mistake. When we said good night, my mother said one final thing. She said, "You did not lose yourself, baby. You set yourself down somewhere for a while. Now go pick her back up." I sat in the quiet of the room after the call ended. The street outside had gone fully dark, and the lamp on the desk made a warm circle of light on the open notebook in front of me. Somewhere on Jones Street below, a door opened, and laughter came briefly through the window and then faded back into the stillness. I opened the notebook again. At the very bottom of the full page I wrote one final line. "I know exactly where I set her down. I am going to go get her." I closed the notebook. I turned off the lamp. I lay in the dark of that Savannah room and listened to the old city settle around me. The particular quality of silence that belongs to a place which has held centuries of human weight and learned to carry all of it without noise. I fell asleep before I had decided anything with finality. That was entirely all right. Some decisions find their true shape in the sleeping rather than the waking. Tomorrow was a different day, and I intended to meet it standing fully and completely upright. Chapter 8. The table Zelina set. I drove back to Atlanta on a Saturday morning. Not to Collier Hills, not yet. I drove to Midtown and parked on West Peachtree Street and walked 2 blocks to a building where a family law attorney named Patricia Wynne maintained her practice on the 4th floor. I had found her name through a colleague who had navigated her own difficult process 2 years prior and had spoken about Patricia Wynne with the particular quiet gratitude of someone who had been guided through genuine darkness by a person who knew the terrain. Patricia Wynne was a composed woman in her mid-50s, with the unhurried precision of someone who has spent decades sitting across from people in the most difficult moments of their lives and learned to move carefully and accurately through each one. She shook my hand and waited. I told her everything, the card and the charges, the fraud investigation and its findings, the police report, the 42 voicemails and Sibella's recordings, the bank investigator's confirmation of deliberate premeditated planning, the call about Renata Stubbs, Richard's admission that he had known the complete history before we ever married. Patricia Wynne listened with a yellow legal pad in front of her and a pen she used rarely but precisely. When I finished, she reviewed her notes and looked directly at me. "What outcome are you seeking?" she said. I had thought about that question for 3 days in Savannah. The answer had arrived somewhere on Interstate 16 between Savannah and Atlanta, the way the truest answers tend to, without announcement, fully formed. "I want documentation," I said, "a legal record of what was done and by whom that exists independently of Richard's family's willingness to cooperate. I want accountability that does not depend on anyone deciding to be honest. And I want to understand clearly what my options are going forward. All of that is entirely achievable," she said. We talked for 90 minutes. She outlined the criminal process and what it was likely to produce. She explained the civil options for full recovery of the stolen funds. She explained carefully and without pressure what a formal separation filing would preserve and protect. I did not make final decisions inside that office. I listened. I asked precise questions. I took notes with the same focused discipline I apply to the most complex client analysis on my desk. Before I left, I told her about the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. Her pen paused on the pad. I told her a colleague had mentioned a journalist at the paper who covered financial crime and patterns of exploitation within families, methodical, not sensationalist, focused on documented, repeated behavior. "What would you want from that contact?" she said. "I want the pattern on record," I said, "not for public spectacle, for documentation that exists outside the family and outside the criminal case. Dorothea did this to Renata Stubbs, and it disappeared because Renata agreed to handle it quietly as a family matter. I will not allow this to disappear the same way." Patricia Wynne nodded slowly. "There are specific ways to pursue that without compromising the criminal case," she said. "I would want to review any communication before it goes forward." "Of course," I said. I left her office and walked back to my car on West Peachtree Street. The Atlanta afternoon was sharp and bright, with that particular winter clarity that makes the city look freshly cleaned. I sat in my car for a moment before starting the engine. I thought about the word Patricia Wynne had used. Achievable, not complicated, not disproportionate. Achievable. Within the clear terrain of what the law supported and what evidence documented. I drove to Collier Hills. Richard was home. He had sent careful text messages throughout my days in Savannah, and I had responded briefly each time to confirm I was well. He had not driven to Savannah. He had not escalated. When I walked through the front door, he was in the kitchen looking like a man who has been sitting inside his own reckoning for days and has stopped trying to find a way around it. "Sit down," I said. He sat immediately. I placed 3 things on the kitchen table in front of him. The first was the bank investigator's written confirmation, the documented evidence of how Dorothea had obtained my card number, the timestamp on the photograph, the 6-week deliberate waiting period, the precise sequence of transactions executed with clear premeditation. The second was the complete police report documentation from the Atlanta Police Department precinct on Ponce de Leon Avenue. The third was a single sheet of paper I had prepared myself, a complete financial record, dated precisely, documented from our joint account statements and my personal account records, of every financial contribution I had made to Richard's family across 7 years of marriage, the school supplies purchased for La Quinta, Dorothea's medical copays, the groceries for Sunday dinners, cooked in a house where I was never genuinely welcomed, the full Thanksgiving funded entirely from my personal account, the cost of repairing my car after La Quinta returned it damaged, every amount, every date. The total at the bottom of that page was significant. It represented 7 years of a woman consistently funding the comfort of people who had never once paused to consider hers in return. Richard read each document in complete silence. He moved through every page with the focused stillness of a man who has decided to stop looking for an exit from accountability and simply stay inside the truth of what the truth actually is. When he set the last page down, he placed both hands flat on top of it and looked up at me. His eyes held the wet and careful stillness of a man holding himself at the edge of something he had been raised never to cross in front of another person. "I did not protect you," he said. "No," I said, "you did not." I knew what she had done to Renata. I knew the full shape of it. And I told myself she had changed, and I brought you into 7 years of something I should have warned you about before we ever began. "Yes," I said. "That is exactly what you did." He looked at the documents beneath his hands. "What do you need from me?" he said. I looked at my husband. This man I had loved genuinely and without reservation. This man with the honest laugh and the steady hands and the real and present heart that had nonetheless learned, before I ever arrived in his life, to make itself small and accommodating in the one place where it was most required to be large and protective. "I need you to stop managing," I said. "I need you to stop arranging situations for other people's comfort and start being honest about what happened inside this marriage. I need you to be willing to say clearly, to your family and to anyone who asks, what your mother did and what your sustained silence allowed." "And us?" he said quietly. I held his gaze for a long moment. "I do not know yet," I said. And that was the most truthful thing I had spoken in 7 years. He nodded. He did not push. He sat with the 3 documents beneath his hands and looked at me with the open and undefended stillness of a man who has finally run out of arrangements to make. I put the kettle on. I made tea for 2 cups without being asked and set one in front of him without comment and sat back down across from him at our kitchen table. We did not speak for a long time. We simply sat with what was real between us. Not reconciled, not resolved, not performing anything for the benefit of anyone else. Just 2 people sitting inside the full and unvarnished truth of their situation. It was not comfort, but after 7 years of choosing smooth surfaces over honest ground, sitting inside something true felt like something I was not willing to set down a second time. Chapter 9. Dorothea asks for forgiveness. There are moments in a woman's life that arrive without announcement and ask everything of her at once. I did not expect mine to arrive in the lobby of my own office building on a Tuesday morning in March, with Dorothea Fenn sitting in one of the grey upholstered chairs near the entrance, her hands folded in her lap and her coat buttoned all the way to the top, looking like a woman who had been waiting long enough that the waiting had taken something visible from her. I saw her before she saw me. I had come down from the 4th floor to collect a document from the front desk. I stepped out of the elevator and turned, and there she was, sitting very still with her hands folded and her eyes on the entrance doors, as if she had been watching every person who walked in and mentally discarding each one that was not me. I stopped walking. I stood in the lobby of my workplace on West Peachtree Street, and I looked at Dorothea Fenn, and I made a decision that took approximately 3 seconds. I crossed the lobby and stood in front of her. She looked up. Whatever she had prepared to say dissolved the moment our eyes met. She looked diminished in a way I had never seen across 7 years of Sunday dinners. The particular authority she carried in every room, that settled certainty that she was the fixed point around which everything else was expected to orbit, was entirely absent. What remained was smaller, older, stripped of every instrument she had ever used. "Zelina," she said. "Come with me," I said. I walked her to a seating area in the building atrium, a quieter space off the main lobby with low chairs and a wall of windows that let in the full weight of the March afternoon light. I sat across from her, and I waited. Dorothea placed her purse carefully on the floor beside her chair. She folded her hands in her lap, the gesture of a woman who no longer trusts what her hands might do if she left them unmanaged. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she began. She did not make excuses. I want to be precise about that because it matters enormously. The woman who had left 42 voicemails cycling through justification and accusation and barely contained threat, that woman did not show up in my building's atrium that Tuesday morning. What showed up was something I had never once seen from Dorothea Fenn in the entire span of our acquaintance. She told me she had been wrong, not mistaken, not confused, not driven by circumstances beyond her control. Wrong. She said the word plainly and without anything around it designed to soften it. She told me she had looked at that receipt on my counter and made a choice. She used that word too. Choice. She said she had told herself it was temporary, that she would replace the money before I noticed, that it was not truly theft because family does not steal from family. She said she understood now how deeply dishonest every one of those thoughts had been. She told me about Richard. She said she had watched her son struggle in the weeks since everything came to light, and she had understood for the first time, not conceptually but fully, in the way understanding sometimes requires loss to become real, what her behavior across years had cost him. She said she had raised him to manage her, and had not understood until now that in doing so she had prevented him from learning how to protect anyone beyond her comfort. She said that was her deepest regret, deeper than the card, deeper than the money, deeper than the criminal case and the bank investigation and every voicemail she wished she could permanently erase. She said she was sorry. The atrium was quiet around us. Somewhere behind us the front desk phone rang twice and was answered. A pair of colleagues crossed the lobby, talking about something with the easy noise of people in the middle of an ordinary workday. The March light came through the wall of windows and sat between Dorothea and me on the low table, and neither of us paid it any attention. I let her finish completely, every word. I did not interrupt, and I did not redirect, and I did not offer the small sounds of acknowledgement that smooth a difficult conversation into something more comfortable for everyone in it. When she stopped speaking, I was quiet for a moment. Then I told her the truth, not with anger, not with the accumulated heat of 7 years pressing behind every word, but with the full and steady weight of a woman who has finally stopped making herself smaller to fit inside spaces that were never built to hold her properly. "I have been thinking about forgiveness," I said, "not as a gift I give to you, as a decision I make for myself, about whether I am willing to keep carrying the weight of what you did inside my own body. That is what unforgiveness ultimately costs the person holding it. I have decided I am not willing to pay that cost indefinitely." Dorothea looked at me without speaking. "So I will work toward forgiving you," I said, "for my own peace, for the sake of my own life going forward. Not because what you did was forgivable in any easy or immediate sense. Not because the consequences are resolved, not because we are family." I leaned forward slightly. "But I need you to hear what I am about to say," I said. "Forgiveness and trust are not the same thing. They have never been the same thing. Forgiveness is something I will extend inward, toward my own healing. Trust is something built outward, through time and through consistent behavior I can observe with my own eyes. You have not built that. You spent 7 years actively dismantling it. What you are asking me for today is not forgiveness. You can have that. What you are asking for is reinstatement, a return to the access and proximity you had before, that I cannot give you." She was very still. "You will not be in my home again," I said. "You will not be at my table. You will not have access to my finances or my personal information in any form. Those are not punishments. They are simply the boundaries of a life I am building that has no room in it for what you brought into the years behind me." Dorothea looked at her hands in her lap for a long moment. Then she looked up, and her eyes were wet and undefended, and she said 2 words. "I understand. Not I disagree. Not that is not fair. Not an appeal to family or to Richard or to the years of Sunday dinners she had always believed constituted a kind of currency. Just, I understand." I stood up. I extended my hand. She took it. Her hand was smaller than I remembered. Or perhaps I had simply never paid enough attention before to notice. "Take care of yourself, Dorothea," I said. I walked back across the lobby and into the elevator, and back up to my floor, and back to my desk on West Peachtree Street. I sat down. I straightened the notepad in front of me. Then I sat very still for a moment, and I felt the particular and unfamiliar sensation of a weight, not gone entirely, not dissolved, but shifted, rearranged, moved from a place where it had been sitting directly on top of me to a place where I could see it clearly and choose what to do with it. I picked up my pen, and I went back to work. Chapter 10. The door she chose. I did not leave Richard in an airport. I did not deliver a speech at a dinner table or write a letter or stage any departure designed to communicate something to anyone other than myself. I did not perform the ending because the ending was not a performance. It was a decision, quiet and certain, and arrived at the way the most permanent decisions tend to arrive, not in a single dramatic moment, but through the slow and steady accumulation of everything a woman finally allows herself to know. The decision announced itself on a Saturday morning in April, when I was standing in our kitchen in Collier Hills, making coffee, and Richard came in and said good morning, and I looked at him, this man I had loved genuinely and without reservation for nearly a decade, and I understood with complete and compassionate clarity that I had stopped waiting. Not stopped hoping, stopped waiting. There is a difference between those 2 things that took me a long time to understand. Hoping is something you do inside yourself. It costs you something, but it belongs to you. Waiting is something you do for someone else. It costs you everything and belongs to no one by the end of it. I had stopped waiting for Richard to become the man I had needed him to be in the years when it mattered most. Not because he was not trying. He was. He had been in individual counseling. He had told his mother clearly and without negotiation what the boundaries of their relationship would be going forward. He had said true things at our kitchen table without managing them first. He was doing the genuine work of becoming a different version of himself, and I could see it clearly, and I honored it completely. But I had learned something in Savannah and in Patricia Wynn's office, and in the atrium of my own building sitting across from Dorothea Fenn. I had learned that a woman can fully respect another person's growth and simultaneously understand that his growing and her healing are 2 separate journeys on 2 separate roads that do not necessarily share a destination. I told Richard on a Sunday evening in April, not at the kitchen table. We had sat at that table through enough heavy things that I did not want this to be another weight it held. We sat in the living room in the chairs we had chosen together years ago from a shop in Virginia Highland, 2 chairs that after 3 hours of pleasant disagreement we had both immediately known were right. I told him I was leaving. He did not argue. He did not negotiate. He sat in his chair and listened, and when I finished he looked at me for a long time, with the wet and steady eyes of a man who has known something was coming and chose to face it without flinching. "Is there anything I can do?" he said. "You are already doing it," I said. "Keep doing it. Not for me, for yourself." He nodded slowly. We sat in those 2 chairs in the Virginia Highland lamplight for a while after that, not speaking, not trying to compress years of love and loss and growth and failure into language that could adequately hold it, Some things do not compress. Some things you simply sit beside until you are ready to stand up and move forward. I stood up first. I found an apartment in the old Fourth Ward, a clean and light-filled space on the second floor of a building on Edgewood Avenue with tall windows and hardwood floors and a small balcony that looked out over a stretch of the neighborhood I had always loved for the way it held the old and the new side by side without either apologizing for itself. I furnished it slowly and deliberately. Only things I chose without consulting anyone and without considering what any room would look like to a visitor. My desk near the largest window, my books arranged exactly as I wanted them, a kitchen stocked with precisely what I actually cook and nothing maintained for the benefit of anyone else's appetite. I enrolled in the Executive Leadership Program at Emory University's Goizueta Business School, something I had deferred quietly for years, setting it aside each time it came up, because there was always something in the household that seemed to require the time and attention more. I paid the enrollment deposit on a Tuesday afternoon from my personal account, and I sat at my desk afterward, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time: unencumbered. La Quinta appeared before the court, as required, and the restitution process was formally ordered and underway. Dorothea had made no further contact since the morning in the atrium, and I had made none toward her. That silence was not hostile. It was simply the natural quiet of a boundary maintained by two people who now understood its necessity. Sibella came for dinner at the old Fourth Ward apartment on a Friday evening, 3 weeks after I moved in. She brought wine and the warm, uncomplicated energy of a woman who is genuinely happy for her friend without requiring the happiness to be explained. We sat on the small balcony after we ate. The April evening was soft and warm, with the generosity that Atlanta evenings carry in spring, the kind of warmth that feels like a gift the city gives freely after the long grey compression of winter. "How are you?" Sibella asked. Not the social version of the question, the real one. I looked out over the neighborhood from the balcony of my own apartment, the lights of the old Fourth Ward coming on one by one as the evening deepened, the sound of the city in its Friday rhythm below, unhurried, layered, alive in the way that cities are alive when you are finally present enough inside your own life to actually hear them. "I am well," I said, and I meant it in a way I had not meant it in a very long time, not performing wellness, not managing toward it, not maintaining its surface for the comfort of anyone nearby, simply, well, actually and genuinely and quietly well. Sibella raised her glass. I raised mine. We did not make a toast to anything in particular. We did not need to. Some things do not require language to be fully honored. The following Saturday morning I went alone to Freedom Park. I walked the long path along the eastern edge, where the old trees stand close enough together that their canopy filters the morning light into something soft and dappled and entirely particular to that stretch of ground. I had coffee in my hand and no destination within the park and no schedule waiting on the other side of the morning. I walked slowly. I thought about the woman who had rented a room in Decatur and revised her 5-year plan every January. I thought about the rooftop in Inman Park and an honest laugh and 3 seconds that told the truth. I thought about a scratched-off gift card and 42 missed calls and a receipt on a kitchen counter and the deliberate architecture of a theft that had been building long before the money was ever taken. I thought about my mother's voice in Savannah. "You did not lose yourself, baby. You set yourself down somewhere for a while. Now go pick her back up." I had picked her up. She was here, walking through Freedom Park on a Saturday morning with coffee in her hand and the full and unencumbered morning ahead of her. Present, awake, occupying every inch of the space she had always been entitled to occupy. She was here, and she was not going anywhere. I finished my coffee at a bench near the eastern path, and I sat for a while watching the park fill gradually with the easy Saturday morning energy of a neighborhood living its life. Joggers, dog walkers, young parents with children running ahead of them on the path, an elderly couple walking slowly with the practiced ease of people who have been walking beside each other for a very long time. I watched all of it without requiring any of it to mean anything beyond what it simply was. Then I stood up. I straightened my coat. I walked out of Freedom Park and into the rest of my life. And I did not look back.